Hello and welcome to year 2 of the Civil War. And so we're starting sort of spring of 1862, and we're going to start in the West, where again we have some success for the Union for the North. First, down in the southern part of the Mississippi River, around New Orleans, down in here, they're able to gain control of New Orleans, and they're starting to move up the river while another group is moving down the river. This city right here of Vicksburg will be the last stronghold, but we're not there yet. And we've got a major battle up in the north known as Shiloh is the name of that battle. Now, Shiloh was Ulysses S. Grant, and it was an extremely bloody carnage battle with a lot wounded and many killed. 13,000 for the Union soldiers, 10,000 casualties for the Southern soldiers, the Confederacy. Now, those are casualties. Those are not dead. Those are dead and wounded. And there's more wounded than dead. And what Shiloh did was demonstrated that the South was fairly weak and vulnerable in the Western theater, the Mississippi theater. Grant, because of the number of dead, took a really big hit in the public mind. But for Lincoln, he remained quite loyal to Grant. As he would say it, Grant fights, the other ones don't. And so he's very much continuing to catch Lincoln's eye. And New Orleans was under the leadership of a guy called General Farragut there. Now, in the Eastern theater, there's Shiloh, a very open warfare. And it showed the necessity of building fortifications, building trenches. The South surprised the Northern camp early, and there wasn't really, good protection for them. And then the Northern soldiers counterattacked and fought back, and we had our battle. In the East, it's continuing frustration for the Union in their inability to capture Richmond, and getting frustrated by the man on the bottom there, which is Robert E. Lee, who is at this time going to take command of the Army of Northern Virginia, which is the big army for the South in this area. So we've got McClellan up at the top there with his big army, the Army of the Potomac, which is, by the way, wherever it is, it's the largest city down in the South. And Robert E. Lee's big army, the Army of Northern Virginia, which is smaller, but Lee will prove to be the better general. And, at the prodding of Lincoln, McClellan devises a plan that's known as the Peninsula Campaign, where he will travel by boat down and then go up the peninsula to Richmond. So not the previous time they'd come this way, now they're going to try this way here. And McClellan got very close to Richmond. He could see the smoke from the chimneys. They're just outside of it. And it's at this time Lee was placed in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia. Previously, he'd been the military advisor to President Jefferson Davis, but now he's put in charge of the army. And he dug in and built defenses to protect Richmond. But then, instead of waiting for the assault, he took the initiative. So he built up defenses and was sort of expecting, I'll defend, they'll attack. But he saw that McClellan's right flank of his army was vulnerable, that they were separated, and he took the initiative to attack, even though it was very risky. He risked losing Richmond by diverting some of his soldiers to attack McClellan's right flank. But it worked. McClellan's soldiers panicked. There were skirmishes lasting 7 days, and this is why this is known as the Battle of 7 Days. And it culminated with the Army of the Potomac, which is much larger than Lee's group, retreating back to Washington, having failed in their objective. And on the last day of the battle, one of the Southern subordinates to General Lee, he ordered a frontal assault on a well-defended position. That means, a direct attack on heavy defenses, and it led to the death of a number of Southern soldiers. But in the end, Lee had prevailed, and he'd prevailed against a much larger and better prepared force. And Lee was now given full command. He reorganized and made plans to invade the North and bring Lincoln to a negotiated settlement, is going to be his plan. Lincoln, by the way, in this battle, had diverted reinforcements to help McClellan and instead diverted them to protect Washington, D.C. Because of Stonewall Jackson, Southern general, was sort of threatening up in the northern areas, up in Maryland, and McClellan will blame Lincoln for why he lost, but I don't think that's really fair. McClellan did outnumber his soldiers when it came time to fight. Did not execute very well. So Lee's now going to bring his army north. He understands a key thing here is that morale, the ability to think if you can win or not, is very important in war, especially among civilians. And he wants to bring the war north and show the Northerners that they can't defeat him, that they can't win this war, and to grow anger and frustration and have that directed towards President Lincoln and hoping to force Lincoln into a negotiated settlement. And so as he brings his army north, they'll have a second battle of Bull Run, same result, and then he crosses the river, the Potomac River, which is the dividing line, into the Northern Territories and pursuing the Army of the Potomac, and they have a big fight at Antietam, as it's called. Now, Antietam Creek is where it was. McClellan really took it to Lee in terms of fighting. His army, Lee's army, was in a very precarious and dangerous position, but Lee showed a lot of poise and confidence. 14 hours the battle lasted. Lee lost 14,000 soldiers. McClellan had fresh reinforcements. Even so, the Confederates, the Southerners, were willing to continue the fight, but so was McClellan this time, and Lee decided to make the decision to retreat back to the south. And though it was not the victory Lee was looking for, he had brought the war north. Northern morale was severely low, and Lincoln responded by firing McClellan at this time. Famous photograph of the war. Antietam, by the way, and remains the single bloodiest day for Americans in all of their history. They would lose more soldiers than any other day in American history. McClellan's out. A guy called Ambrose Burnside is the new general of this Army of the Potomac. And interesting, McClellan will be the Democratic nominee for the presidential election in 1864. So this is 1862, late 1862, and you're looking at, in 2 years' time, who are going to be running against each other for president of the United States. And neither really had much respect for the other. And Lincoln at this time makes a decision that he needs, for reasons of morale, for diplomatic reasons, he needs to change the entire nature of the war and make this a war of freeing the slaves. This is no longer a war to restore the Union, but now it's a war to free the slaves. And he issues what's known as the Emancipation Proclamation, or the Emancipation of the Freedom Proclamation. And it's an interesting document. A statement. It's a proclamation. It's a statement that all slaves in Confederate territory only are now free, and that freed about 50,000 immediately freed, but there's still 4 million who are in Confederate territory, but they're not freed. And I'll get to that in a moment. As Union soldiers advanced, the slaves would be freed. So where the Confederates are still in control, the South still has control, which is most of the South. Slaves are not freed because Lincoln has no authority over those areas. And in the border states, the slaves there were not freed because they're not in Confederate territory. It made abolition of slaves in the explicit war goal, and it's done for military purposes, as we said. So it was issued after the Union victory at the Battle of Antietam. Lincoln was looking for some kind of like positive gain in this war that he could make this. The intended audience is France and Britain. France and Britain, while they would welcome an independent South, they also know that they could not side with the Confederacy if this is a war of abolition, because there's so much public support in these countries for the North, for the Union. And Britain could put pressure on gaining more of Oregon. France expands its empire into Mexico, South America, weakening of its rival there. Now, it frees few slaves, right, at first. In time, it will free all of them, but it's an executive order. It could be reversed by the next president at any time. So it doesn't have a lot of weight behind it in terms of freeing the slaves. And if you look at the last point there, where Lincoln could free slaves, where he had authority, like the border states, he did not free them. Where he had no power, that's where he freed the slaves. It's kind of ironic in that way. And this is done at the end of 62. It took effect January 1st, 1863. And this war is now going to be a revolutionary struggle. And what we mean by that is that it's now a war to completely change the Southern society. It's not just we get them to surrender military. We have to completely change their society. Anger in a lot of places, tempered joys from the abolitionists, because they understand, it's a toothless tiger. It doesn't actually really free that many, but it is going to lead to a lot of slaves increasing to run away, because now you don't have to get all the way to the north. You just got to get to the army that are moving into their areas. Democrats strongly opposed it, and strong opposition from the Irish, which we'll get to in time. But the middle class of Europe strongly pulling for the Union, and it's going to keep Britain and France out of the war, and that's the main purpose of this. So as winter progresses, both sides are going to have to look at getting more soldiers. Now, famously, Lincoln had said, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and it's not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." And it's that last one he does. Freed some, but left others still enslaved. And Britain is kept out. And for Britain, the South was really relying on them and thought that this was, their golden ticket to winning. But if you look at for Britain, their warehouses were stuffed with cotton, because the 1850s had been a boom for cotton industry. They're getting production from Egypt and India, and they didn't really rely so much on the South for their cotton. They could get it from somewhere else, but they do rely on food crops from the North and the West. And so ultimately, is this king corn would be more decisive than king cotton. King corn of the Midwest, the food supplies that they're getting from them, and cotton, not so much the importance that the South had been expecting. Okay, sorry, I'd gotten a little ahead. The draft is instituted at this time, and it had been an army of volunteers to this point, but it's not good enough for the North, and they introduced a conscription, and you could buy your way out of it, and that's not going to be very popular of an idea that you're chosen, all right, here's $300 and you're getting out. So the poor, of course, can't do that. And they're also looking to Europeans, for mercenaries and things like this. The South, with the smaller population and less immigrants coming in, they're really going to be strained. There were boys in their armies. There were older people in them. They were, for the most part, a volunteer. They exempt from the draft those who had over 20 slaves, with the argument that they had to make sure that there's no slave uprising. And this led to a lot of resentment from that hillbilly group in the South. And because we're getting more opposition to the war, we get General Order Number 38, as it's called. And this is an order issued by the Army saying that, any dissent, we are not going to take it. And anybody voicing opposition is going to be arrested. And, opposition to the draft or whatnot. So really showing that in the North, that they're being quite serious about keeping opinion as pro-war as possible. Okay, so that's where we are heading into the third year, with Lee really showing tenacity in the East, and in the Eastern Theater not having success yet again, but having some success in the West as they close in on the Mississippi River. All right, thank you very much for listening. That's where we're going to stop.